We're pleased to have Senator Dennis Patterson here with us this evening, and I thank Claudine Santos, the Director of Parliamentary Affairs, for organizing his visit. And Senator Patterson served the Northwest Territories in a variety of capacities, including Minister of Education, Minister of Health and Social Services, and Minister of Justice during his 16-year career as a member of the Legislative Assembly. And he served as Premier between 1987 and 1991. He was instrumental in the settlement of the Inuvialuit Final Agreement and the Nunavut Final Land Claim Agreement, which led to the establishment of Nunavut as a territory in 1999. He was named to the Senate on August 27, 2009 by Stephen Harper as the representative of Nunavut. And he currently serves as the chair of the Special Senate Committee on the Arctic. This evening, he will speak about solutions for Northern Canadians and what as one Northerner's vision. And please give a warm welcome to Senator Patterson.
And I'd like to acknowledge your acknowledgement. You said it way better than I could. The traditional lands we're on. Thank you very much for the opportunity to address you all today. It's touching for me to be back at the Arctic Institute. Dr. McDonald reminded me that I did come here about 25 years ago as the Premier of Nunavut, and really enjoyed being here and interfacing with his students at this great institution. And thank you for referring to my terms in the NWT legislature. I'll tell you just a little bit about myself. I came up to the Arctic sight unseen. That was Frobisher Bay in 1975 as a young legal aid lawyer. And since then, I've seen the North undergo tremendous changes. I was privileged to be involved in the historic signing of the, you mentioned the Inuvialuit Final Agreement, and also the major comprehensive land claim of the Inuit, the Nunavut Agreement, and also privileged to be involved in the creation of the new territory of Nunavut, which divided the territories in '99. My hometown has grown exponentially from a small town of about 1,500 people in 1975 to now Nunavut's only city with roughly 8,000 residents and rapidly growing. So I've seen amazing changes, and I just want to mention that I was delighted to meet Dr. Robert McPherson, who's here today for the first time, because Dr. McPherson has written a book, New Owners in Their Own Land, about the, and I'm privileged to have an autographed copy today, about the wonderful story of how the best geologists in Canada were hired by the Inuit to help them select the land in their land claim. And those selections were aided by excellent geological knowledge that the federal negotiators didn't have. So the Inuit managed to pick land that is on or around every one of the current 5 producing mines that have been permitted after a rigorous regulatory process by one of our maiden Nunavut co-management boards, and are now operating in Nunavut and contributing to Nunavut Tungavik, $50 million a year in subsurface royalty revenues, more than their operating budget. This is the Nunavut Land Claims Organization. And also creating tremendous jobs for and business opportunities for Inuit in our territory. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So I've been privileged to see an amazing amount of change, including, imagine being able to change the map of Canada and create that new territory, which was a bit of a miracle and quite a feat, and a 20-year or so effort that involved 2 public votes in the NWT in a very democratic way. But I've got to say, I've also seen the North stand still in some ways. Despite amazing technological advancements throughout the rest of Canada, Nunavut still remains largely unconnected and isolated. You know, there's still no roads connecting any of the 25 remote communities, neither with each other, unless you count snowmobile trails, which are extensively used, but neither with each other nor with southern Canada. And our territory is still wholly reliant on diesel power delivered via sometimes aging generators and on unreliable satellite internet. And we are also plagued with shocking social indicators such as low education attainment, high unemployment, high suicide rates, high poverty. There is a housing crisis that continues to worsen. You know, we had the Prime Minister was in Iqaluit just this past week to make an apology about the tragedy involving Inuit having been removed from their communities in quite an insensitive way to get, I suppose, well-intentioned treatment for TB in southern Canada, but it caused enormous separation hardships on many Inuit, and many did not return, and the Inuit didn't know what had happened to their beloved family members when they didn't come back. I just want to mention that, though, because one of the contributors to TB is overcrowded housing conditions. It's all too common to have people sleeping in shifts in houses because of lack of space and a severe housing shortage. So the Prime Minister came to apologize about the TB episode, and it was a very moving experience for all of us that were there and people who watched across the country and across Nunavut. But the federal commitment to meeting Nunavut's housing shortage in the 2017 budget was what might sound like an impressive $240 million, but that's over 10 years. And it equates to roughly 48 housing units a year. We have a backlog alone of 3,000 units. So we've got we do have many challenges. But of course tonight I wanted to talk to you about solutions, because I do believe there exists a clear path for moving Canada's North forward. And the federal government is currently drafting an Arctic policy framework, fondly known as the APF. We've been expecting this and working on this for the 3 years since the current government got into power. And it's an ambitious project meant to shape Canada's approach to the Arctic until 2030 or beyond. That was one of the reasons the Senate established a special committee on the Arctic, which is the only parliamentary committee wholly focused on the Arctic. And we have structured our study to run parallel with the development of the Arctic policy framework by the federal government. And our study, our work in the Arctic Committee is centered around 6 themes identified in the APF framework, including strong and healthy communities, economic development, infrastructure, climate change, the balance between science and Indigenous knowledge, and the Arctic in a global context. I am privileged to be chairing this committee. I worked with my friend and former colleague, Senator Charlie Watt, to establish it. Our work is still ongoing, and we hope to table a report with recommendations to the government. We will table a report with recommendations to the government in the life of this Parliament this year. I should be cautious, though, and stress to you that the observations and suggestions that I've put forward to you tonight are really wholly my own take on how Canada can build a healthy and vibrant North. We have in the promised Arctic policy framework an opportunity to ensure that Canada takes a coordinated, thoughtful, and whole-of-government approach to build a strong, sustainable, and secure region. This will require strategic investments and a clear vision of the larger picture. I believe that when deciding policy or what to fund, it's easy to lose sight of the interconnectedness of these decisions. And I'll give you this example. On April 30, 2018, a review of the 1972 Pilotage Act was submitted to the Minister of Transport as part of the Oceans Protection Plan. The last substantial changes to the Act were passed in 1998 by the chair of the review, Mr. Mark Gregoire. And he, in his report, stated that $200 billion worth of Canada's international trade is carried on domestic waters. It further suggests that the 4 current pilotage authorities, which provide economic, safe, reliable, and comprehensive marine pilotage and related services in their respected region of responsibility, be amalgamated into one authority. This is pretty important stuff when you're talking about oil-laden vessels in environmentally sensitive waters, and of course a very current subject. So the report suggested that the current pilotage authorities be amalgamated into one. The Arctic was not addressed. No such authority currently exists for the Arctic region. This is the kind of thinking that we have to fight all the time in Ottawa. The interim measures that this government has put forward for the Arctic is the creation of a polar code, which is designed to address the hazards confronted by vessels operating in the Arctic and Antarctic, and is accompanied by the Arctic Shipping Safety and Pollution Prevention Regulations, which are now being developed under the authority of the Arctic Waters Pollution Prevention Act. However, Mr. Gregoire notes in his report that these measures are short-term. That, in my opinion, is the sum of the problem with Canada's current approach to the Arctic. Every action is short-term in nature, with government departments and ministries all too often acting in silos. Global warming is an undisputed fact with Northerners, seeing real and measurable effects on our everyday lives. My community of Iqaluit, which is the largest community in Nunavut, has a water crisis. Who would think that there's a crisis over water in the Arctic? There's lakes everywhere, but we're losing 40% of the water in our underground utilidor system to leakage because of shifting permafrost, breaking and damaging and causing leaks in the line. It's just one small example of the challenges that we're dealing with in climate change. And you know that probably that the Arctic's sea ice extent has experienced a steady decline since 1979, with a record low in 2016, dropping from just over 13 million square kilometers in 2014 to about 12 million square kilometers in May of 2016. This decrease in the sea ice extent and multi-year ice will eventually lead to an increase of activity. More mineral and resource exploration could be stimulated in the region. We've already seen an increase in maritime traffic from pleasure, tourism, and shipping vessels, as well as from transient vessels such as cruise ships. The territories have also experienced growing fisheries potential. And that actually might be a benefit to us, because we know that we've seen that fish species, salmon is one, are moving north into our waters, into colder waters that are warming in southern latitudes. So we've got a very successful and growing fishery potential and a fishery. We've experienced growing research activities and more adventure travel. Yet the development of Transport Canada's promised low-impact corridors for the north is not expected to be completed before 2022. Meanwhile, smaller pleasure crafts and large cruise ships, and unfortunately, there has not been a catastrophe, but large cruise ships and even an oil tanker have run aground or got lost due to the fact that a very small percentage of the Northwest Passage is currently charted. Some estimates only 1% of the Northwest Passage is charted. And the fact that Canada is woefully underprepared to manage and regulate transit through this important national seaway. And you know, it's quite a sport to see the people that are, it's like the people that adventure to the pole and the people that try to go through the Northwest Passage. I mean, we've had people who have tried to do the Northwest Passage on Sea-Doos, for goodness sake. So an increase in transit through Arctic waters, not to mention the increase in polar air traffic, will inevitably lead to an increase in accidents and incidents in which search and rescue capacity will be crucial for Arctic communities. In this example alone, federal funding and federal initiatives must coordinate across at least 3 different ministries, that is, transport, fisheries and oceans, and defense, to ensure that the proper resources and infrastructure are placed in the north to respond to this rapidly changing reality. Deep water ports, refueling stations, and increased search and rescue assets need to be strategically placed throughout the north. You know, there's a port in every little tickle and bite in Newfoundland and Labrador, and I've sailed that coast, and God bless them. You know, there's a federal wharf everywhere in the Atlantic and on the west coast. What about the Arctic? You know, the Navy is building a deep water fueling facility in Nanisivik on the east end of the Northwest Passage. It's behind schedule and over budget. There's a port now finally being built in my community of Iqaluit as a result of an initiative of the previous government, but we're really very short of port facilities. Our fishing vessels have to refuel and resupply in Greenland, which is unfortunate and embarrassing because of our lack of the marine infrastructure Canadians take for granted on the other coasts. I've also long advocated for an increased maritime role for the rangers, as the rangers in Nunavut are mostly Inuit who've had a marine-based economy for millennia and know the offshore better than anyone else. But DND doesn't seem to want to budge. They have given them a mandate to operate on the land, but not on the water, where their skills and knowledge are invaluable. We also have to ensure when we look at making policies and legislation for the North that options are not foreclosed. This is what I meant when I said that we need to have a long-term, big-picture approach to the North. For me, that means devolving more powers to the territories and decentralizing decisions mostly made in Ottawa that have long-lasting effects on the Arctic. Northerners should have the ultimate control over their waters, lands, and resources, as northern governments have found a way to meaningfully integrate Indigenous knowledge with scientific research to inform their policies. And they have more Indigenous representation than our centralized federal government. So it's ironic to me that comprehensive land claim settlements in most regions of northern Canada have given Indigenous people and their institutions a significant land base. And the Inuit of Nunavut own or control a total of about 18% of the surface and subsurface lands in Nunavut, which itself comprises 20% of the land mass of Canada. So they're the biggest private landholders in the world. And Indigenous peoples in the territories have also been given, through the so-called comprehensive land claims agreements, a major voice in reviewing development projects. This is something that's the envy of Indigenous peoples, Aboriginal peoples all across the country. Inuit in Nunavut are at the table evaluating proposals and deciding how to mitigate impacts or whether to mitigate impacts. That's the way to bring people on board. And also through those agreements, in addition to a meaningful voice in reviewing development proposals onshore, there's a guaranteed share of resource revenues. A revenue flow of 5% of the Crown share on projects on Crown lands, and the full royalty share, which can amount to something like 12% for projects on their own lands. And as I mentioned, this has netted significant revenues to the Inuit of Nunavut on top of the benefits they got in cash compensation in settling their land claim in '93, and on top of the benefits that they achieved through impact and benefit agreements, which are required to be negotiated by every mining project in Nunavut with Inuit to provide Inuit employment opportunities and business opportunities. And they're making progress in working in our rapidly growing mining sector. In fact, I met an Inuk geologist who graduated from McGill University in geology from my community of Iqaluit, who is working for Agnico Eagle Meladine Gold Mine project as a geologist. And I met her at the mine site in the cafeteria. I was amazed to discover. And I just learned that there's actually 2 Inuit who have graduated with geology degrees in Nunavut. So we're slowly seeing Inuit get involved now in even higher levels in management of mines. There's a vice president of the big mine in gold mine in Hope Bay of TMAC Resources, who's worked his way up, an Inuk, and this is a very good story. There's also an amazing proportion of women working in mining in Nunavut. Senior positions, way better equipment operators, the companies tell me, than men, just like they're probably better drivers than us men in the South. But the challenge is that although the Inuit are in the driver's seat through their land claim agreement on participating in review of projects, obtaining a share of revenues where projects are approved and benefits, the government of Nunavut also has the responsibility to deal with the impacts of development with no authority to make decisions on developments onshore, no ultimate authority. That still belongs to the federal minister in Ottawa. Devolution agreements in the other, so-called devolution agreements to hand over province-like responsibilities for lands and resources are concluded in the other 2 territories, Yukon and NWT. They have some province-like authority over the development of onshore resources, but the federal government still claws back a percentage of royalty revenues, even where devolution has been achieved. And then none of the 3 territories have any jurisdiction on the offshore, despite their citizens having established sovereignty for Canada in the Arctic, and despite successful co-management models in Atlantic Canada, which include adjacent provincial governments in the management of the offshore. My dream is that the rights of Inuit in the offshore, which flow from their marine-based economy and their traditional use of the offshore, and those rights have never been surrendered, that they'll have ultimately a voice in the management of the offshore, just as they now have a voice in the development of onshore resources through the Nunavut Agreement. So my dream is to see a co-management regime set up for the offshore, just like we have working very well in the onshore. That would involve the duly elected representatives of all the people of Nunavut through the government of Nunavut, Canada's role as manager of fisheries and environment and other federal responsibilities, and the Inuit, all sitting at a table making joint decisions on the important question of development of the offshore, renewable and non-renewable resources. But I've got to tell you that I'm very concerned right now, and there's some legislation before the Senate that we're dealing with. In fact, I'm the critic for some of this legislation and its potential to have a devastating effect on the involvement of the people of the North in decision-making about their lands and waters and resources. So C-55, which is a bill before the Senate now, the Oceans Protection Act, seeks to grant unilateral powers for the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans to establish marine protected areas. I don't want to say for a minute that I'm against marine protected areas, but what's going on right now is that Canada has signed on to the UN biodiversity goals, calling for protection of 17% of the inland water and terrestrial areas, 17% of the land of Canada, and 10% of coastal marine areas to be protected under UN biodiversity goals. That's okay, but without adequate consultation with the government of Nunavut, it's shocking to me to think that if Canada was to proceed with designating 2 areas that are now well advanced in discussion in the Arctic Ocean, one of them is Talurutio-Imanga, known as Lancaster Sound, and also the so-called last Arctic ice refuge in the high Arctic basin. These is being worked on as protected areas. And if those areas fall under protection, and by the way, they cover a roughly 209,000 square miles, which is roughly a third of the area of the province of Alberta. These are not small areas. And by the way, they are said to contain massive oil and gas reserves, 2 Hibernias in Lancaster Sound, and the high Arctic basin is adjacent to the Sverdrup Basin. So this bill gives the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans the unilateral authority to designate these protected areas without consulting the people that are affected by this and the duly elected government of the territories, and it applies to all of the Arctic Ocean. It also includes no requirement to assess the oil and gas or fishery potential in these areas. So we're freezing, the minister will have the authority to unilaterally freeze big chunks of our waters without really knowing what resources are in there, including the fishery. So sometimes southern priorities are not northern priorities. And I want to just quote what the World Wildlife Fund says on their website about these protected areas. I'm quoting from the World Wildlife Fund website. Limiting climate change is the most important thing we can do for ice-associated life, but we can also take action locally. We can avoid additional threats from activities such as oil and gas exploration, commercial fishing, tourism, and shipping. Tourism? We're going to discourage tourism in the Arctic? Or shipping? which is a lifeline for our communities, or fishing, which is employing currently 300 Inuit in Nunavut who are working their way up to positions of authority on these formerly Newfoundland-owned fishing vessels. So, about Bill C-55, the government of the Northwest Territories, the president of the Inuvialuit Regional Corporation, and the government of Nunavut, the premier of Nunavut, have strongly rebuked this process as it undermines ongoing negotiations regarding Indigenous rights in the offshore and the potential that I described about for co-management in the offshore through devolution. And Canada has agreed to discuss the management of the offshore in the Northwest Territories and in Nunavut, but they're taking this unilateral action to foreclose economic development potential in very large chunks of the Arctic. And the result of protecting these areas the end result would be that Nunavut has contributed, will contribute 8% of the total 10% of the national target. That's because we're a federal playground. They have jurisdiction. They can act unilaterally. They don't have to consult the duly elected government in the adjacent territory. Can you imagine them trying to do that to a province like BC or Newfoundland and Labrador? But they think they can get away with that in the Arctic. And I'm challenged to confront them on that, and as I'm doing in the Senate with Bill C-55. It really bespeaks of the colonial Ottawa knows best, which our current federal government says it deplores in other contexts. Another example, Bill 86, the Budget Implementation Act 2. By the way, governments of all political or both political stripes love omnibus budget bills. And the Trudeau government, or the Justin Trudeau, when he was leader of the opposition, deplored them and condemned them. And now he's introducing even bigger omnibus budget bills. The Budget Implementation Act 2 was a 500-plus page omnibus bill. You can imagine the challenge of dealing with these pieces of legislation. By the way, the famous SNC Lavalin deferred prosecution agreement amendment to the criminal code was snuck into budget, to that same Budget Implementation Act. And I don't think it even got any attention in the House of Commons. We noticed it in the Senate and called for the Minister of Justice to come and explain this amendment, but she declined. But I want to talk about another aspect of this budget bill, and that's an amendment to the Canada Shipping Act. And that allows the Minister of Transport to unilaterally bar shipping, transport, and other marine activities in order to ensure the protection of the marine environment or introduce alternate routes without input from adjoining jurisdictions or stakeholders. Again, unilateral action without the respect or involvement of the adjoining jurisdictions of the Aboriginal people who've established sovereignty for Canada in those waters. Finally, there's Bill C-48, which would establish a tanker moratorium in BC and could set a dangerous precedent regarding shipping and transportation through any area considered environmentally fragile or pristine, which the North certainly is. Together, these bills create a web of legislation that could negatively impact the future economic viability of the North without allowing for Northerners to make those decisions for themselves. And you know, I want to be realistic about the sensitivity of oil and gas exploration and drilling in the Arctic. This has to be handled very carefully and with the highest standards, if it's going to be allowed at all, that we would have in the world. But Northern people should be involved in making those decisions that are going to impact them the most over an environment that they know best, and environment they care about and rely on for sustenance and their spiritual identity. So Canada needs to give the publicly elected territorial governments the tools and resources required to make informed decisions about their future. So I keep talking about the big picture. So let me, in closing, share with you what I believe the big picture looks like. I see an Arctic that has a strong and stable economy that consists of many sectors. I see mineral and resource development leading to opportunities to provide not only good jobs, but also business opportunities for Inuit-owned businesses. Capitalizing on our rich mineral wealth will allow growth of the service sector, hospitality and transportation, and other service-based industries. I see the North evolving from a public sector economy, which is sadly highly dependent on income support and featuring significant unemployment, especially in our smaller communities, moving from that public sector economy to a diverse economy with a thriving private sector. I see the economic stability allowing parents to build their own houses instead of being restricted to overcrowded social housing. I see more money in the pockets of workers for items like our sky-high costing food and basic necessities like gasoline and home heating oil, on which, by the way, the federal government will be imposing carbon tax increases this year, even though hunters and homeowners have no viable alternative energy options. I joke, sometimes maybe the government wants us to go back to living in igloos and using dog teams, because carbon taxes are intended to encourage people to seek alternatives to fossil fuels. Unfortunately, we don't yet have any viable alternatives to fossil fuels. And I don't really think it's fair what's being imposed on the people already struggling with the highest cost of living in the country. But my vision is that hunters will be able to afford hunting equipment, which then supports the subsistence economy. In my opinion, increasing the access to so-called country food is a major component to solving the overall food insecurity issue in the North. The federal government has a program called Nutrition North, which subsidizes the cost of freight so that we can fly tomatoes and lettuce and cauliflower and broccoli, milk and eggs to the remote communities in northern Canada. But there are rich natural resources. There's an abundance of Arctic char, for example, the best fish you can find. And we're not incentivizing or supporting the development of our own renewable food resources. It has to be managed, of course, carefully. Caribou are in crisis in some regions in the north, so we have to be careful about it. But there's a way of capitalizing on our rich renewable resources. So this new era that I envision of adequate housing and food security would enable children to focus on their schooling and would address, I've got to tell you, the dismal truancy rates facing the North right now. We just had the release of recent figures showing attendance in schools in Nunavut. 7 out of 10 children are not attending school on a regular basis. In some communities, half the kids are not in school on an average day. This, of course, predictably leads to failure to graduate. It's widely believed the absence of curriculum materials and instruction in the children's first language, Inuktitut, is a large factor in these dismal realities. Improving high school graduation rates would mean more students would pursue a higher education, such as many of you here are currently doing, leading to a new crop of professionals in the North. It would mean in my home territory more teachers, doctors, nurses, and lawyers. And by the way, we have some of all those professions, including doctors, and who speak Inuktitut and understand the complexities and nuances of life in the North. When you have this kind of prosperity and stability, artistic industries can thrive. And boy, do we ever have talented artists and filmmakers and fashion designers. Northerners would no longer be living every day to survive. Giving them the time on opportunity to focus on the arts, which in turn draws tourism, as we've seen in communities such as Pangnerto and Cape Dorset. I see a future of happiness and general wealth for the territories. I see Nunavut and other northern territories able to capitalize on our significant and high-quality mineral resources. And that was the vision Bob McPherson had when he advised the Inuit on taking advantage of the existing mineral resources, which has borne great fruit for them. I see the North as evolving from being highly dependent on federal transfer payments, a dependence which is as high as 90% in Nunavut, to eventually becoming a have jurisdiction, making a contribution to the Canadian economy. But to achieve this, we need to start making the North more competitive. We need investments in roads, ports, and alternative energy in order to attract companies looking to invest in operations in the North. You know, our government has $180 billion committed, our current government, to infrastructure over the next 10 years. I really hope, and it's going to be a battle, I really hope that the bulk of that $180 billion doesn't go in to shorten traffic delays in the major municipalities of this country. As important as that is, there's an investment to be made in the 40% of Canada that lies north of 60. We need strategic investments in internet to ensure that all communities have access to this basic necessity so we can start to improve access to health, education, and justice services. Of all the places in the country that needs high-speed internet and connectivity, the remote off-road regions and communities should be the ones who are getting attention. It'll take money, vision, and political will. But I believe that we have an opportunity to build a strong and vibrant North that I know we can become. And I should just say in closing, we're still waiting for the Arctic policy framework. The Arctic policy, it is yet to be released. The months are running out in the current session of Parliament, which is expected to end in June. So we're hoping with bated breath that the government will deliver on its promise to deliver a new Arctic policy. Our committee is going to do the best to make sure that it is a good policy and that we make recommendations for improvements if we think they're needed. So my privilege to give you some thoughts on where we're heading in the North and some solutions. And I understand there might be a bit of time available for some questions. I'd be happy to take any questions that anyone might have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Patterson. That was awesome. So in order, I don't know, I guess we'll pass around the microphone if you have questions to respond. And so let me just turn this on here. And so you have a question?
Hi, I'm just wondering, like, what is, well, instead of, begging a relatively inept and incompetent federal government to smarten up, what is stopping the North from just taking ownership of the North, declaring independence, and then partnering with a country that's more interested in helping them out or partnering with them? Because there's lots of money in China to build ports, right? And they got better ice-breaking capabilities than Canada does. The Russians have better ice-breaking capabilities. The Danish will probably be more helpful, right? So all they have to do is declare independence and ask some other country for help. Wouldn't that wake up the federal government?
Well, I've got to tell you, that's a radical idea. But I mean, the three northern territories, Yukon, Northwest Territories, and Nunavut, are all creatures of the federal government. We don't have a constitutional right to our jurisdiction the way provinces do in this country under Section 91 and 92. We are still territories. We're actually still, in some respects, a colony of Canada. So the Nunavut Act, the Yukon Act, The Northwest Territories Act are all statutes of the federal government, and they give us the jurisdiction that we have. And it's not to be a sovereign state. Now, I know what you're saying about attracting investment from other jurisdictions, because we're having a challenge with finding investors in the challenging environment in the Arctic. So, you know, I'm working on a project with a Chinese-owned zinc mine in the western part of the Northwest Territories. It's called Isaac Lake. It's owned by MMG, Minmetals Group, majority ownership in China. And the Inuit of that region have welcomed the company's investment, welcomed the fact that the company respects the Inuit land claim agreement and is not going to bring hordes of Chinese workers into the mine. Will do its best to employ Inuit. And they've even developed a proposal, which I'm championing in Ottawa, that the Inuit will build a road to Tidewater, which will bring the zinc product and a port. It'll be a 225 kilometer road, and it'll actually link the Arctic coast and Nunavut to the North American highway system through Yellowknife if it's built. We're trying to get a piece of that infrastructure money, but it's really a partnership with the Chinese. And I know they're being courted to in other regions of Nunavut because they have money to spend, and we should be open to that, I agree. But I don't think the route is by declaring sovereignty. I don't think that would go too well, especially this is the hand that feeds. Nunavut gets 90% of its operating budget from Canada with our fledgling economy. So you have to be careful about biting the hand that feeds, I would say. And maybe that's a bit of a conservative approach. But if I was younger, I might be a bit more give you a more radical answer. And I'm gonna, if you can hold that, there's another chap, if you mind, I'll give you a second chance.
Thanks. I have a couple of comments and a question. Interesting you mentioned about educating the Northerners in their native language. There was an article in The Economist just a couple of weeks ago that was talking about that. It was in reference to Indian children and African, but it said exactly the same thing, that their level of education once they get to junior high is so much better if they are educated early in their native language. So just kind of timely that you would mention that. The other comment I have is quite striking that you mentioned a couple of times about the Indigenous peoples of the North claiming sovereignty of the North for Canada. I think that's really important, something that Southerners don't understand, that is a big deal. And I hadn't given it any thought until you mentioned it, but I found that comment telling. My question is, would you be supportive of the territories, all three territories, lobbying for provincial status?
You know, that's a very profound question. The truth is, I'll give you a very pragmatic answer. The truth is that under the current formula financing agreement that is in place with Ottawa, which benefits the three territories, and I told you Nunavut, because of its very early developing economy, is getting roughly 90% of its operating budget from Canada. That territorial formula financing agreement is way richer than the transfer payments that would go to the poorest province of Canada per capita. Now, I'll just tell you exactly how significant this is. Nunavut, with 38,000 people, has a budget of about $2 billion for that number of people, 90% of which comes from Canada. Now, that's because there's 25 widely scattered communities, there's no roads, there's climate and remoteness challenges. It's very expensive. So those of us who've looked at provincehood have said, well, wait a minute, we're getting a better deal than the poorest province right now. And what we should do, instead of asking for provincehood, is we should negotiate province-like powers. So when I was Premier of the Northwest Territories and in the Cabinet, we negotiated the transfer of health from Canada. So that's a province-like power. We persuaded Minister Jacob, at the time Minister of Health, to transfer health to the Northwest Territories. We bought the federally owned Northern Canada Power Commission, the power utility for the Northwest Territories, from Ottawa. We transferred authority in a number of other areas, mine safety, and highways. And so I call it provincehood by the back door. We get the powers and privileges of provinces, but retain our special status due to our remoteness and the more generous financial support we get from Ottawa. That's just my straight up answer to you, is it's a better deal to be a territory.
Hi, thank you for this talk. It's really interesting to hear your perspective about this northern solution.
Thank you.
I have a quick question about the C-55, and I'm trying to understand how it's impacting the Inuit. So, figuratively speaking, you mentioned that the government will have jurisdiction over the marine protection area. What does that mean in terms of the country food security for the Inuit? Does that mean that that will restrict the Inuit hunting marine mammals? And if so, will that infringe the Section 35 of the Constitution Act?
Parks that, national parks even, that have been established in the territories have carved out rights for Inuit for subsistence hunting. So no, the marine protected areas would not interfere with that traditional harvesting right. But what I'm concerned about is that we're developing a commercial fishery in the Arctic, and it would freeze economic opportunities like commercial fishing, and dare I say it, under the strictest conditions, the potential for further oil and gas development and exploration, if that's economically feasible. But no, it wouldn't affect subsistence activities.
Yeah, in Calgary, just last week I saw a bumper sticker and it said, "I support global warming." Is that the general consensus? Or people just saying, yeah, we'll just adapt, it's totally fine with us?
You know, we joke about climate change or global warming in the Arctic. Sometimes when it's 40 below and a howling blizzard. And by the way, the Prime Minister tried to fly into Iqaluit last Thursday, and I woke up this morning and said, oh no, he ain't coming here today. I can't see across the street. So, you know, we joke about where's this global warming? Because, you know, it actually can manifest itself in blizzards just like hurricanes in the south and cold weather. But the truth probably is that there may be some benefits, but the truth is it's really been quite devastating to our simple things like foundations for buildings and roads. You know, they've had enormous problems with the Dempster Highway, and buildings have been built on permafrost in the expectation that it wouldn't melt. But that's changing now, and there's massive structural problems in buildings. And I mentioned our water and sewer system. 3 diamond mines in the Northwest Territories that are operating, and by the way, I had no idea when I was in the NWT government that there were even diamonds, that there was such a thing as diamonds in the North, but we're producing now high quality diamonds to replace dwindling supplies in South Africa and Australia. And I was just at De Beers' amazing office here at the Calgary, what's it called? The Calgary, anyway, right by the airport, there's an industrial center there, and De Beers has a state-of-the-art office managing their Canadian operations. they're looking at building a diamond mine about 125 kilometers from Iqaluit. But I mentioned the diamond mines because 3 of them in the Northwest Territories are dependent on winter roads for the delivery of their annual fuel resupply and materials. And the roads are melting, particularly at the Yellowknife portal of the road. So there was just an announcement yesterday, or a few days ago, that Canada and the Northwest Territories are partnering to begin the planning for an all-weather road to supply these diamond mines and other potential mineral resources in the rich Slave geological province, because everybody can see that the roads are, there's risk there, just as there are in the northern provinces. So it's a real concern, and the tragic manifestation of climate change is a struggle for hunters, with sea ice. And we're losing experienced hunters because of changing conditions. And that is very distressing to people who rely on the sea ice, as Inuit do. So no, it's a very serious problem. But some of us have cheaper heating bills, So we joke a little bit about it's not all bad, but the truth is the North is the canary in the coal mine for climate change.
I understand the highest suicide rate among youth in Canada is in Nunavut. By far, is there a strategy to deal with that and to try to bring in into the mix and provide opportunities for young people?
It's our most debilitating plague. It affects so many people. We have the highest suicide rate in the world, as you point out. And, the question is there something being done about it? It's been declared a crisis by the government of Nunavut, by the Premier of Nunavut. There's an Embrace Life Council that is established and well-funded, which tries to help people to take better care of themselves and their communities by watching for warning signals and providing mental health and other counseling resources. I think we're slowly making progress. We're seeing some diminishing trends in suicide. I've found that communities like Baker Lake and Rankin Inlet, where there are easy and attractive employment opportunities in the mining and mineral exploration field, are happier communities with less of those kinds of problems. But when you look at the assaults that have been inflicted on the Inuit that I know best in Nunavut, from forced relocation, you've heard those stories of people who've been moved, human flagpoles, some people cynically call them. So there were these forced relocations. There was the TB problem, and we were just visited with the impacts of that last week. The whole territory was gripped once again by the stories that every family, my first wife was an Inuk, and I remember going to a tiny community in southern Manitoba with her to try to find her mother's grave. Her mother left their camp when she was 10, never came back. She never knew what happened or where her mother was buried. We managed, with the help of the sanatorium that was still standing and a priest, to actually find her mother's grave, and she had some closure that not everybody has. So when you add these problems, when you add the residential school experience to these problems, there's a lot of people who are dealing with trauma. And the challenge of providing mental health resources in 25 remotely scattered communities is enormous. I'm working very hard, as a result of C-45, the cannabis bill. We learned and pointed out in the Senate that Aboriginal people, a percentage of them are particularly vulnerable to, and I'm not saying everybody, but vulnerable to depression and anxiety from cannabis use. They're more vulnerable than perhaps than other segments of the population. So we finally got federal support for building a treatment, a mental health and a treatment center for Nunavut, and a strategy to have community-based mental health support. This is an enormous need, and it will help. But it's a struggle, as you point out, and it's probably one of our most anguishing social problems to deal with that, because our communities are so small, extended families are so large, it really cripples a community. It often happens, and I did legal aid for some years in the north, and we'd come into a community and we'd find out that somebody that was going to court had committed suicide the night before the court arrived, and it causes enormous grief and anguish in our communities. And I'm glad you raised the question. It's a challenge and a struggle that we all live with, but I think we're making slow progress. I think this gentleman wanted to have a second round. Ask me an easier one than the last one, please.
No, the thing is, all they have to do is not cooperate with the federal government. If they don't cooperate, what is the federal government going to do? They need the Northern Rangers, right? They're all Inuit. Our military can't do anything up there, right, without them. So you know what I mean? All they have to do is just not cooperate. And if traditional methods, traditional drug treatments and the traditional mentality doesn't work, why not send yoga instructors up there so they can basically learn self-discipline and help themselves, right? Wouldn't that be cheaper?
For Inuit, like, my experience has been that the healing and the restoration of wellness is always connected with the land. So programs that will take people out on the land and take advantage of the excellent abilities of elders to deal with surviving in the harshest climate in the country. That's the way we restore health and wellness. And okay, well, sure. So I think we're tackling those challenges as best we can, using the resources that are in our communities, and they're rich resources. We got to take better advantage of them. And I think governments are learning that bringing in trained masters of social work graduates who don't know the people and don't speak the language is not as effective as supporting people in our communities to get that training who can be trusted and respected. So I think that's a direction we got to go in. And this new treatment center and the community hubs that we're working on is going to provide that culturally sensitive support. And maybe yoga can be part of it. So thank you. And I believe we're coming to a close here. I do want to very much thank the Arctic Institute for this great opportunity and for the good work you're doing. And I hope that I'll have an opportunity to come back before 25 years next time. Thank you very much.